imagine that you are not a vegan. Imagine that you eat meat and you're biting into a juicy hamburger, and your dining companion turns to you and says, hey, you know what, Chris, that hamburger is not made from beef. It's made from golden retrievers. Now, chances are what you just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And therefore, rather than continuing to eat this hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets and protest.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back today with another episode. We're going to talk to somebody today who is very cool. We have Melanie Joy. She is a social psychologist and author. One of her most famous books is Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows. How you doing?
Hi, I'm doing really well. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having this conversation.
Oh, it was easy to have you on. I've seen other interviews with you, and I just thought, this is a good, empathetic, smart person. I got to ask you some questions. So right off the top, what was your journey in becoming vegan?
Yeah, well, it actually started a long time ago in my childhood. And, you know, like many people, at least in the US and the West, I grew up with a dog who I loved like a family member, you know, and of course, I also grew up eating meat, eggs, and dairy. And, you know, over the course of so many years and so many meals, I never thought about how strange it was that I could be petting my dog with one hand while I, you know, ate a pork chop with the other, a pork chop that had once been an animal who was at least as intelligent and sentient as my dog. You know, I didn't make the connection between the meat or eggs or dairy on my plate and the living being it once was. You know, and I was always a person, like most people who cared about animals and would never, you know, want to contribute to their suffering, especially when that suffering was so intensive and so completely unnecessary. But as I said, I wasn't connecting those dots. But all of that changed in 1989 when I ate a contaminated hamburger, and I got really sick, and I wound up hospitalized on intravenous antibiotics. And after that experience, I stopped eating meat not because of any, at least not any conscious ethical decision on my part, but you know, when you've just been like violently ill, the last thing that you ate, like you just associate with puking basically and other things. So I was just like, okay, that's disgusting. That's never happening again. And so I kind of became at the time a vegetarian by accident. And, you know, this was in the 80s. And so I started, you know, learning about how to cook for myself and, you know, what to eat. And, you know, and as I was doing my research, I stumbled upon information about animal agriculture. And, you know, what I learned shocked and horrified me. I could not believe the extent of harm and suffering to so many animals. And I mean, like in one day, you know, the global number of farmed animals slaughtered is more farmed animals are slaughtered in a single day than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. Like the numbers are like staggering, and the suffering is just incredible. And I couldn't believe the extent of the harm to the environment, you know, to human health. And, you know, this was back in the 80s before we knew anything close to what we know about today, about the issues. And so I was shocked and horrified. In this process, I had met somebody who was actually a vegan, and so I eventually became vegan. But what shocked me even more in some ways about this information was that like nobody I talked to about what I was learning was willing to hear what I had to say. Like they would say things like, don't tell me that you'll ruin my meal, or they'd call me like a radical vegan hippie propagandist. And I was just like, oh my God, like what? These were like rational people. They were compassionate people. They were my dear friends and family members, most of whom had like very strong feelings around social justice, you know, really wanting to do the right thing. And I became very curious as to how people could just stop thinking and feeling when it came to this issue of eating animals. And, you know, this ultimately led me to enroll in a doctoral program in psychology. I studied the psychology of violence and nonviolence broadly, and my later work reflects this. And I narrowed the focus of my research to write my doctoral dissertation on the psychology of eating animals. And this is actually what led me to identify what I came to call Carnism, which we can talk about, the invisible belief system that conditions people to eat certain animals. It's basically the opposite of veganism. And it's what led me to write my book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, and ultimately to found my international NGO, Beyond Carnism.
Incredible. It doesn't take much, just a certain moment of enlightenment, and then all of a sudden you realize there's a cognitive dissonance out there where you go, they just don't want to see it. Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance, there's this internal discomfort, which you're referring to, this that people feel, we all feel when our values and our behaviors are out of alignment. That's what cognitive dissonance is, right? So, and there's been a lot of interesting research on cognitive dissonance. Research has shown that we all need to feel like we're living moral lives. Like we all need to feel like we're basically good people, right? But most of us do not live in alignment with our values. I mean, we can't in this very imperfect world that we've inherited, but there are some really big ways in which we live against our values, and eating animals is one of them.
Yeah, the cognitive dissonance for me was shocking, and I think it has a lot to do with the modern world, but it's really hard to put my finger on. But that's why I had you on. And veganism really starts with some kind of real empathy and compassion and stuff. What do you think is the relation between veganism and other social equality, social justice movements?
Well, so a couple of things. I mean, not everybody stops eating animals, or becomes vegan or even moves toward veganism because of empathy and compassion. Some people do this really just out of a sense of pure justice. People who are sort of more cognitively oriented rather than emotionally oriented. There are lots of people who are working to change the world for animals because they genuinely believe in their minds that this is the right thing to do. This is the ethical choice to make. Nevertheless, people come at this from different angles. Nevertheless, it is, even though the experience of each set of victims of violent or oppressive systems, we could call them, systems like Carnism, which I've talked about, patriarchy, racism, classism, and so on. I mean, there's lots of various atrocities that are happening in the world, various systems of oppression. Even though the experience of each set of victims will always be unique, these systems themselves are structurally similar. They're structured in the very same way. And most importantly, the mentality that enables the violence is the same. The same mentality that enables us to carry out harm against certain individuals of members of human groups is the mentality that enables us to carry out violence against animals. And so, often when we work to, create a better world, to end oppression, for one group, we're not really targeting the roots of the problem, which is the psychology that drives oppression. So we often end up sort of trading one form of oppression for another. I hate this analogy, but it's like this game of whack-a-mole, right? Where, you hit, which is a very species, like a horrible thing to say, actually, if you care about animals, but like you hit one mole down and another one pops up. But, but the point is, and this is what, my research led me to conclude, was that the psychology of oppression, the psychology of violence, right? It is the same, regardless. The content, who is oppressing whom, changes, but how and why we oppress and abuse is, remains pretty consistent in our mentality. So this is, one of many reasons why, regardless of what kind of oppression you're targeting, you're trying to end, or even if it's none, you just want to have a better world for people, for all of us. We really need to think about how our minute-to-minute behaviors and choices, align with this core belief that we have.
And this is why I asked you the question, because I have a feeling when people talk about race rights or gender rights or animal rights, it feels very similar, where we can't just get down to the ideology and say, hey, it's nice to be nice. Let's be nice instead of being oppressive jerks. So we touched on cognitive dissonance, and it keeps people from understanding that connection between meat and animals. In your professional opinion, how can we address this kind of dissonance and help people kind of be aware of this contradictory behavior?
Yeah, well, so cognitive dissonance, as we were talking about, is the moral discomfort we feel, the internal discomfort that we feel when our values and our practices are out of alignment, right? So if we think to ourselves, I am a compassionate person when it comes to how I treat animals, which most people do think. We are all raised to recognize that it's important to be kind to animals. We understand that when you see a kid harming animals, that's a sign of a potential pathology, psychopathology, right? So most people, really do believe in, they share this belief that they are compassionate. Most people actually are compassionate in many ways toward animals. And yet most people also eat animals. And that means they act against this core value of compassion. And so there's this internal discomfort, this cognitive dissonance, this sense of internal guilt that they feel. Cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable. And when we feel it, we want to mitigate it or alleviate it. And we can do that in one of three ways, right? We can either change our beliefs change our values. Instead of saying I value compassion, we say, well, I don't, I value cruelty. That's not going to happen. We can change our behaviors, which means to stop eating animals. Usually that doesn't happen either. Or we can change our perception of our behaviors. And it's around this third option that Carnism is organized, right? So, and I'll explain how this works. So Carnism, as I said, it runs counter to core moral values. The most notable is compassion. Justice is the other most notable value of fairness, right? Most people would never, ever willingly support intensive and extensive and completely unnecessary violence toward other animals. They just would never support it. And yet most people do support it. And the reason they can support it is because of Carnism. Carnism is a special it's a belief system, as I said, and it's a special kind of belief system. It is what's called a dominant system. That means that its teachings, its tenets are so widespread that they're invisible. They're woven through the very structure of society. They shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And they're institutionalized. They're embraced and maintained by all major social institutions. So, for example, when we study nutrition, we're actually studying carnistic nutrition. The legal system is a carnistic legal system. Factory farmed animals have no rights whatsoever. So I could go on and on about this, but the other aspect of Carnism that makes it unique is that it's an oppressive or a violent system, as I mentioned earlier. And in order to ensure that people support this system who normally would not, Carnism uses a set of psychological defense mechanisms. These defense mechanisms, they distort our perceptions and disconnect us from our natural empathy for those animals we've learned to classify as edible, so that we act against our values and our own interests and the interests of others without even realizing what we're doing. So basically, Carnism provides us with the tools to hide our cognitive dissonance from ourselves. And I can give you and your listeners examples so that this is not an abstraction and it'll make a lot more sense. So imagine that you are not a vegan. Imagine that you eat meat and you're biting into a juicy hamburger and your dining companion turns to you and says, hey, you know what, Chris, that hamburger is not made from beef. It's made from golden retrievers. Now, chances are what you just thought of as food, you now think of as a dead animal. What you just felt was delicious, you now feel is disgusting. And therefore, rather than continuing to eat this hamburger, you probably want to throw it in the trash and maybe even take to the streets and protest. That's because you have not had your perceptions distorted by Carnism. Your reaction to that hamburger is your authentic reaction. You haven't been deeply conditioned to see a dead animal as food and to find its flesh appetizing rather than disgusting, right? And so this is how Carnism operates. And so some of the defense mechanisms, this might be familiar to some listeners. So for example, Carnism teaches us to think of farmed animals as abstractions, right? As lacking any individuality or personality of their own. So we learn to believe that a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. So it's a distancing mechanism. We don't think of dogs this way. We recognize their individuality and their sentience. Carnism teaches us to think of farmed animals as objects, right? So we refer to the chicken on our plate as something rather than someone. It's another distancing mechanism. Carnism teaches us to justify eating animals. And, the main way that we learn to justify eating animals is by learning to believe that the myths of eating animals are the facts of eating animals. And there's this vast mythology around eating animals that we've all inherited and adopted without realizing it, that all these myths fall under what I refer to as the 3 ends of justification. We learn to believe that eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. These are myths that we have learned to accept as universal truths, as facts. And not surprisingly, these same myths, these same arguments have been used to justify violent practices throughout human history, from, male dominance to heterosexual supremacy. So basically, when we're born into this dominant system like Carnism, all of us internalize that system. We learn to look at the world through the lens of the system. We actually inherit these defenses and these cognitive distortions, or these psychological distortions. And many, many people who have been born into Carnism, and I surely was one of them when I was before I, had my experience and stopped eating animals. We're conditioned to feel defensive against anyone or anything that would help us get out of the carnistic box. So very often, people meet a vegan and it's like, okay, stop, don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal. And it's like the wall goes up. Like, all you have to do is say to somebody, I'm vegan, and the wall goes up, and you start hearing all the reasons that veganism is wrong from somebody who maybe had never even heard the word veganism before you shared it with them 3 minutes ago.
There's nothing more frustrating, I think. And I think it's really interesting because we have things called ag-gag laws, which also through, the legal system and through a cultural system make it so we stay cognitively dissonant against the things that might open our eyes. So morality and ethics, this is usually why people choose to go vegan. Are ethics and morals, are they a subjective concept? Do they change from person to person, or is there a more standard definition? Is it built in us that we need to keep sharp?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people who move toward veganism for other reasons. I mean, because my husband, who runs an international vegan organization as well, says that veganism is like a multi-problem solver. I mean, it's not the solution to all the world's problems, of course, but no solution is complete without it. And it does take on a number of issues at once. So, it is, for example, the United Nations has pointed out that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to some of the most serious problems facing the environment today, not the least of which is climate change. So there are many people who move toward veganism or become fully vegan, not because of, I guess you would say this is because of ethics, it's for the environment, but not necessarily out of animal welfare concerns. It is also, eating animals is also a leading driver of, some of the most serious and preventable diet-related diseases in the world today as well. So a lot of people are not eating animals because of, concerns about their health. And so there are lots of reasons, like entry points into veganism, reasons people become vegan. I choose not to frame the issue or discuss the issue through the lens of ethics, because very often people can feel defensive around ethics. And yes, it's ethics are subjective. Values, however, most people, when you have this conversation and you really ground it in values, if you're talking about this component of it, we know, for instance, at least research shows that there are certain universal human values that are espoused throughout, human cultures, all human cultures, and they're waged to a greater or lesser degree. But the two most widely espoused human values are compassion, which is caring, and justice, which is fairness. So we can safely say that the majority of people around the world espouse these two core moral values, and very few people would argue against them. Most people would not say no, I'm not caring. I don't believe in caring. Caring is not part of my value system. Fairness is not part of my value system. So we know that, and that makes the conversation easier to have. And we can say, okay, you believe in compassion, you believe in justice, and yet when you contribute to harm against other sentient beings, unnecessarily, that's clearly counter to your values. And I don't even like to frame the conversation this way, because it does put people on the defensive, and it really doesn't acknowledge the fact that the vast majority of people are doing this not because they don't care about animals, but they're doing this because they basically have been duped and like steeped in misinformation and disinformation. They've basically been brainwashed, into not making important connections. So, and I think it's important to include that in the conversation, or at least in our awareness as we're talking about these issues with people, because it gets very easy to blame people who eat animals and look at them as bad people, rather than recognizing that we live in a very problematic, dysfunctional system. Like we've inherited a mess, that we're all a part of.
Yeah. The system seems to thrive on people to overlook compassion in order to, imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, everything is meant to be exploitative, and they need us to look away from that idea in order to. But one of the greatest things is saying, if you convert somebody to veganism, is say, taste this, this is vegan food, it's delicious, and then you're not hurting anybody. And I found that to be one of the most effective, because the selfish nature of humans is say, well, it's good for your health. Oh, okay. Well, I care about me for sure. So vegans are alienated from mainstream society, can become frustrated, depressed, and even a little hostile sometimes. I know I'm guilty of that. The sons of bitches. How do we navigate on our side away from these attitudes and avoid the confrontation and the dogma, and kind of try to reach these people better?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that, people who choose to not eat animals because they want to be healthier, I think that that's like, that is also an act of compassion, and it's self-compassion. And self-compassion is really important for everybody to engage in. The better we can treat ourselves in ways that are, it's great when it's win-win, doing less harm to everybody involved. The more we're moving toward the kind of relational style we want to see in the world. And I'll answer your question by starting with something that might seem unrelated, but is not. When you think about some of the most pressing problems in the world today, and also in our personal lives, right? Like war, poverty, racism, patriarchy, animal exploitation, climate change, domestic violence, self-harm, addictions, trauma, we can go on and on. It's like when you look at these like major problems in the world today, you can see that they share a common denominator. We tend to think of them as all distinct, but they really do share a common denominator, and many common denominators. But one that I think is really important and is typically overlooked is the common denominator of relational dysfunction, or dysfunctional ways of relating, right? Between social groups, between individuals, between humans and animals, between humans and the environment, and also between us and ourselves. We're always relating to ourselves, through our self-talk or through the choices that we make that impact our future selves, and so on. And so I come at this conversation through the lens of relationality. I think that's incredibly important to guide how we relate as vegans to non-vegans, and beyond that. So if relational dysfunction is because relational dysfunction is a common denominator among these really pressing problems in our world, and also in our personal lives as well, most of the suffering we experience in our personal lives, whether it's in a dysfunctional workplace or family system, or with our intimate partner or whatever, is because of relational dysfunction. So a common denominator in resolving all of these problems is building relational literacy, which is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy ways of relating. When we learn how to do that, like basically, if we weren't living in the relational dark ages, we wouldn't be electing relationally dysfunctional, toxic world leaders, or supporting, relationally harmful public, policies and practices. We would know better. So I have my later work is on actually looking at, I have a new book coming out called How to End Injustice Everywhere. And it's looking at oppression and injustice through the lens of relational dysfunction. And a lot of my work is about healthy relationality. I have a book called Getting Relationships Right, and it's like a one-stop guide to building relational literacy. I feel so strongly about this. And so, the good news is that when we engage in healthy relational behaviors, whether those are toward our own selves by treating ourselves, practicing compassion toward ourselves, or our intimate partner, or our companion animal, or the pigs we're choosing not to eat. When we engage in healthy relational behaviors, we are practicing the kind of behavior that we need to see more of in the world if we want to change the world for animals and for humans. So when vegans are communicating with non-vegans, the tendency is, understandably, as you pointed out, there's a lot of hostility and a lot of anger. And many vegans feel an incredible sense of urgency around the message, because there is a sense of urgency, and it's deeply frustrating and painful to be awake, to be aware of the fact that we're living in the midst of what can only be called a global atrocity. And most people in the world are, not only disregarding, like blaming us for trying to raise awareness of it and, try to fix a broken system. So it is hard, and it can be infuriating. And Carnism, conditions people, as I said, to resist anyone or anything that would get them outside of the carnistic box. And what that means is that very often the people who are resisted are vegans. You just open your mouth and say, I'm vegan, and then that's it. And Carnism, like other systems of oppression, it keeps itself alive by making sure that people, the populace essentially, continue to believe that eating animals is the right thing to do, and that not eating animals is the wrong thing to do. And so a lot of people inherit these like negative vegan stereotypes that just kind of come out at vegans all the time. And it is exhausting. It's very empowering to choose not to eat animals and to know that you're, kind of living in alignment with your values in this way every day. And it can be really exhausting. And if you don't have the tools, especially if you don't have the tools in the community. And so we have, at my organization, Beyond Carnism, we run the Center for Effective Vegan Advocacy. And we have a lot of tools and materials for people who want to raise awareness of this issue of carnism, and do it in a way that's effective, that doesn't trigger more defensiveness, that's relational. Because if you don't communicate in a way that's relational, you're probably going to make people defensive and more wedded to eating animals. And then you're going to burn yourself out, because you're just going to be like in the line of attack even more than you already are. So when you say, how do we talk about this issue? The most important thing any of us can do, I was going to say who wants to raise awareness, but just period. It's life-changing. Like building relational literacy is like building literacy. It's like life-changing. Life gets easier. Relationships get better. If you're feeling frustrated and misanthropic, you stop hating on people so much, and you start treating yourself better and having healthier relationships around you, which make it easier to be alive in this very, very dysfunctional and messed up world.
Yeah. It took me about 30 years to realize that it's 99% compliments and, greasing the wheels with people, and then 1% criticism is about the best you can do, because the stubbornness and as soon as you start with confrontation, it's like, oh, my fingers are in my ears and I'm not listening. Well, with people like you, I hope that we can make some progress.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And you are, you do make a point where when you talk about like the amount of effort, it takes sometimes to have these conversations and to have these conversations go well. I think it's important to just also remember that a lot of people in the world are not ready to move toward veganism. And like people move toward veganism for a lot of different reasons, or they don't, move toward veganism for a lot of different reasons. And unfortunately, over 8 billion people in the world today. Many of those people are not ready to hear this message. And that's okay, because we don't need the whole world to hear this message. We just need to reach critical mass. Real change is going to happen when institutions change, so we need to reach the right people in the right positions of influence. And I know it's also, if you're an individual vegan, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, yeah, but I really want, like, what can I do? I really want to be able to like influence the people in my sphere, in my inner circle. The best way to do that is to, number one, if people are close to you, rather than asking them to go vegan, I don't even recommend asking people to become vegan. I suggest just ask people to be as vegan as possible. Like just say to people, just be as vegan. Here's my ask, be as vegan as possible. Because nobody can be more vegan than what feels possible to them. And most people aren't defensive against that ask. Because what are you going to defend against? No, I'm not going to be as vegan as possible. Well, then, I mean, that means you don't even have to change at all if you don't want to. But I also recommend, just asking people, at least the people close to you, to be a vegan supporter. And a lot of suffering happens in vegans' relationships with non-vegans because vegans feel invisible and like really unseen. And, some of the things that cause you the most sadness and maybe even the most joy, like for many people, being vegan is so central to who they are and how they're moving through the world. And to feel that the people in their lives don't see that and don't get that and maybe even look down on it is incredibly painful. And what you can do is you can say to those people, look, I really would love to be able to share information about veganism with you, not to try to change you, but to help you understand me. Like, I really need you to understand me and why this matters so much to me. And because if you don't, you're probably going to do things that are going to offend me, even if that's not your intention. And I'm never going to be able to feel really connected with you. And that's a reasonable ask. I mean, you can't, in any relationship, you need to know that the other person is like interested in your inner world and like willing to see it. And when people become vegan supporters, meaning they've got your back and they respect you and they get it, they really get it. Even if they're not vegan themselves, it can completely change your relationship. They might be like, yeah, I know I'm still eating chicken once in a while, but like, I'm never going to foist this on you. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be sitting next to you at family dinners and like not laughing along with everybody else and telling them to.
Yeah. Achieving some level of tolerance at the beginning and then slowly say, I'm doing my thing. You do whatever you want to do. And then slowly, that's the best way to get people to come around, I would guess. Yeah. Well, it's a hard road. And that we have to scale up the manufacturing of B12 at the same time. So no, it's not going to happen overnight. So we got to take it nice and slow, but slow and steady towards that direction, I hope. So you've had an incredible career promoting something very important. You've traveled all over the world sharing your research. What have you observed about carnism and veganism in different countries?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, carnism is a global phenomenon, right? In meeting in cultures around the world, people are all learn to classify a handful of animals as edible. All the rest they classify as inedible and, disgusting. And, people in some cultures, that handful of animals is larger than others, but out of like thousands and thousands of possible species, it still is a handful of species that are eaten. But it's also, what I find really interesting is that, even though the type of animal consumed changes from culture to culture, members of all cultures tend to find their own choices to be rational and the choices of other cultures to be irrational and disgusting and often even morally offensive. So it's like the way of relating to edible and non-edible animals remains consistent. It's just a question of which animals are eaten, which animals do not. And the other thing that people around the world have in common, and I mentioned this earlier, is that we all share the same core moral values, basically. And people care about animals. I think I've been in like 50 countries at this point talking about this issue, and largely to non-vegan audiences. And I've it's been a great experience for me and fascinating. And most people, when they do make that connection, when they do wake up, when they do, and the nice thing about talking about carnism is like simply by naming it and exposing the system and the way it's structured internally in your mind, it really reduces defensiveness and it allows people to take in information that they're often otherwise defensive against. And most people really do care. And they don't want to be a part of it. They don't want to be a part of it. And it's really a matter of helping people become aware in a way that feels safe for them and doable for them and providing alternatives. Like it's not enough just to tell people everything that's wrong, all that's wrong with the world. You have to do it in a way that isn't blaming and pathologizing and triggering shame, and also say, and there's another way. And it's another way that works for you, that can work for you. And because the great activist Henry Spira once said, if you go into a negotiation asking for all or nothing, you're probably going to come out with nothing. So it's really, a matter of communicating around the issue to help raise awareness. And what's really exciting is that veganism is support for veganism is like just mushrooming all around the world. It doesn't matter where I am, whether it's South Africa or, Kuwait or Taiwan or South Korea, just vegan restaurants, vegan organizations, support for veganism, awareness of veganism and plant-based eating is exploding. It's incredible.
Wow, you just made me really happy and hopeful.
I'm glad. I mean, because this isn't making the mainstream media. Like it's not going to be on the mainstream news, but it is happening, and it's exciting. Incredible to see it. And I'm not just talking to people, who are vegan. I'm talking to people in positions of leadership in vegan organizations in the movement, and also to, journalists working in the mainstream media. And they're all saying the same thing. It's like, for plant-based eating, however they refer to it, veganism is it's taking off. And that's really exciting, and that's really hopeful. I mean, I do feel quite confident that, at some point, veganism will be the dominant lifestyle. It's not a question of, whether, but when. Because when you look at the trajectory of carnism, it's following the trajectory of other oppressive isms and systems that, are when enough people wake up to them, and have an alternative, they lose their hold.
Yeah. And at the very moment, the global rise in fascism, they're doubling down on this kind of violent idiocy for one last time before hopefully we move forward towards logic and compassion. At least I hope. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball,
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, yeah, all that said, I mean, I do feel, looking at the trajectory of the movement, and, I think some listeners might be thinking like, but wait a minute, like meat consumption is on the rise in places like India. And, there are some places in the world where meat consumption is on the rise. And that's absolutely true. But it doesn't change the fact that support for carnism is shrinking and support for veganism is growing. It's big ag is doing what big tobacco did and exporting its problems, and this is just the way change happens. But, while this problem is being exported to places where there's less, where people have less protections around it for themselves, there's also, we have a global network of activism and of organizations now, and that are aware of this and are working to change this. So I'm not so worried about the fact that consumption for animals is increasing in some places in the world, because I would expect that to be the way. Carnism is not going to just roll over and die. Big ag is not just going to throw up its hands, and there are these big ag companies that are starting to produce a lot of vegan products now too, and sort of shifting the type of product that they're producing.
It's not the greatest thing to have these capitalists go ahead and, but okay.
It's a problem. I know it's a problem. I know. And it's like, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And we've inherited a mess. Like, we have all been born into like a profoundly, profoundly relationally dysfunctional world in so many ways. And change is slow. And I agree with you. We don't want to like reinforce corporatism. And at the same time, I mean, that's not an argument against, support for labor unions and Amazon. Just because we don't like Amazon doesn't mean we don't want to support positive change within Amazon. So
that's a great point. That's a really great point. We will take what we can get and we will move on from there. And I hope that common sense prevails over the propaganda of big cheese and big meat and things like this. Yeah. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. We'll have you back again. Is there anything that you want to add before we go? Some inspiring words, or where we can find your books or anything like that? Anything?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yeah, it's been great, and I'd love to be back again. And if for anybody who wants more resources, they can come to carnism.org. We have a lot of materials. We have a lot of materials for raising awareness, whether you're not a vegan, and you just want to learn about this issue, or you are a vegan, or you're a person who just wants to promote a move away from carnism. We have a lot of materials that could support you wherever you are on your own personal journey. And if you want to be helping other people become aware of this issue as well. So yeah, please come visit us. We really see ourselves as a support organization. So
yeah, go check it out, people. I'll leave some links in the description where people can find you. Incredibly awesome, compassionate human being, Melanie Joy. Thanks for
thank
coming
you.
over. All right.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for this great show that you have to help, raise awareness among so many different types of people around these issues. It's really important. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
We're going to keep it going. We're going to keep the movement working in the right direction. All right. Well, goodbye to everybody in TV land. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.